Hi everyone, and welcome to the PASS Marathon, the new world of data privacy. We're excited you could join us today for Martin Catherall's session, Data Privacy and the Data-Driven Professional. This PASS Marathon features back-to-back live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the PASS community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event. You'll receive an email letting you know when the recordings become available. My name is Richard Munn and I'm a DBA in financial services in the UK. I've got a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Martin. Next slide. If you require technical assistance, please type your request into the question pane located on the right side of your screen and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to Martin. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom buttons located on the top of the presentation window. Please note there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session which will pop up after this session ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for future events, so please take a moment to complete this. Next slide. Look out for the new episode of Redgate's podcast DBAL coming Friday. DBAL 12, Around the World in 80 Data Privacy Laws, gives an entertaining and informative overview of what we've learned this week, and we'll also announce the winner of our data privacy contest. Next slide. This PASS Marathon session is presented by Martin Catherall. Martin is a data platform MVP, data consultant based in Melbourne, Australia, and a PASS regional mentor for the Asia Pacific region. Martin founded the PASS local group in Christchurch, New Zealand, and led the group for a number of years before relocating to Melbourne. He's been using SQL Server in various roles since 2000. In addition to anything data related, he enjoys playing guitar and having fun with the family. Next slide. And without further ado, here's Martin with Data Privacy and the Data-Driven Professional.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Richard. That was a great introduction. So here we go with data privacy and the data professional, staying safe in an ever-changing world. So our agenda for today, or for the next hour at least, we're going to talk about privacy, security, and how do they relate to each other? Do they blur into one another, or are they essentially the same thing? And I've listed out personal development there. Not that we're going to dwell on personal development at all, but I feel that the new landscape needs maybe a new mindset and some new thinking, and throwing in a bit of personal development never did anybody any harm. We'll see how we can maybe go about protecting our employers, ourselves, our clients, and our customers. And as we're talking about data, we're going to talk about data in different environments. How can we protect data in the production environment? And we've already heard in the first session about protecting data in non-production environments, but we'll have a look at that a little bit more because it's been an issue for God knows how long. It's getting much better as we've heard previously, but we could still do a lot better, I think. And then I'll start wrapping up. I'll talk about some permissions and access. I'll talk about a little bit about compliant DevOps. I don't want to dwell on this subject at all because I think you'll hear a lot more about it throughout the day. But it is a theme maybe that will run through the entire presentation, and we need to think about how we can, I don't know, build processes into our software and make a whole lot better. And I'll do a summary and a quick recap. Okay, but before we start, I actually want to do a quick, look at some data to see how bad this situation is. So what I did was I looked at Wikipedia, and they've got a list of data breaches on there. It's probably not a concise list, but it's good enough. It's got quite a few on there. So the list is, if we have a look at that, there's, in the last 14 years, like big data breaches that are on here. we can see that it's 267 of them. There's probably a lot more. But if we look at the methods that people have used to, first of all, we look at how many people had more than one single data breach. And these people here, they have had an unknown number of records stolen from them. But what are the common reasons for data breaches? We heard about how hacking was going down, and I think it is, but we can see that we've got hacking is right at the top. But lost and stolen media, 33, poor security, accidentally published, inside hacking, lost or stolen computers. They're all reasonably common. And they're the type of things that as data professionals, we really want to avoid. And we look at some tools in that to try and avoid this sort of thing. So there's some of the big companies there that are data breaches over the years. We could see AOL, I've had 3. Some big names in there, Yahoo, Uber, Facebook, all suffering data breaches, and some quite big ones. But if you look at like how many have had inside data breaches there, all the big AOL, Vodafone, some hospitals down the bottom, and how many 157 million records stolen through inside data breaches. And then we come down and we'll look at accidental data breaches. 69 million records have been lost through accidental data breaches of staff on premises. So what can we do about this type of thing? First of all, I've done this presentation a few times. Normally it's to a live audience, a lot of people in the room ranging from DBAs to developers to architects to whatever. And I normally start by asking a few questions. Like, it might not work so well in a virtual environment, but just bear with me. I'll say, whose job is it to write code? And I'll get a reasonable amount of hands, developers in there. Whose job is it to design databases? Again, a reasonable amount of hands. People whose job it is to look after the databases, DBAs, a fair few of them in there too. People who look after networks, there's always people in there who've got crossovers with data, or just network people in general. But then I'll say, and whose job is it to look after security and privacy? And there's not a great deal of hands to go up. But I think it's everybody's job. Security is everybody's job. I quite like this slide. I borrowed it off a security consultant at Microsoft, a lady called Tanya Janka. And I've got some resources of hers in the resource slide right at the end. But let's dig on with the presentation. And I think there are some soft skills we need to develop in this new world of privacy and security. Lots of companies now, I work as a consultant in Melbourne. Before I can go into places like banks, they make you sit down for even a couple of days and watch a whole series of presentations about security, about conflicts of interest, about acting safely in their environments. And you're meant to model those behaviors all the time. And they even have got things like whistleblower programs and software and people to test you throughout your time at those places on these behaviors and if you can model them correctly. So leadership, even though you might not be in a leadership role, is a really strong thing to develop. Acting on feedback, automation, making sure we can automate things all the time and get results that are correct and reliable. Culture is a big one. Mindset, as I've already said. Repeatability, as in we talked about automation. Now process, this to me goes along with culture, mindset and process. We might have the best process in the world, but if the culture is not to adhere to it or find a better way to do something, people could easily work around this and it'll undermine our processes and we could have some really detrimental results. And we'll see an example of that very soon. People. I think we've got to educate our clients about what privacy and security means in a virtual environment. I think they generally take privacy for granted. I mean, all letters, our mail comes through, and we've got the feeling that it's safe, it's secure. But is that the same in a virtual world? Probably not, but people don't relate that to it. And there's a whole lot of stuff residing around DevOps and data ops. Technology has got a big role to play, obviously. And in business, we've got people and data. Obviously, as data professionals, we probably like to say that data is the lifeblood of business. And obviously, it is a massive part of business. But people are also a massive part of business, and the two really go hand in hand. People are at the end of all our software we write, at the end of every process. They contribute to the process, absorb the process, consume the process, and ultimately make mistakes in the process. So let's look at how we can maybe avoid those mistakes. But first, let's have a little talk about GDPR. Now, as I say, I don't live in the UK. I might be from the UK. People might recognise my accent as being from there, but I don't live there anymore. So in Australia and New Zealand, I'm thinking, what's GDPR got to do with me? We heard some interesting stuff from Grant before about how Americans and people in the US are looking at data privacy laws. And that's similar to how we should be looking at it over in Australia and New Zealand. But if you deal with a lot of European citizens' data, then it might apply to you. So maybe I'm slightly curious now. But can I draw an analogy with this situation and maybe a technological situation we've seen in the past? If I go back to, like, say, early 2015, Azure SQL database was kind of getting a bit of traction. It was then changing from its base over to SQL 2014 to run on that code base. And I felt it was starting to gain a bit of traction in this part of the world. However, at the time, I was working for a government department in New Zealand. Now they were going to go, well, the project I was on was going to go nowhere near Azure, not for technological reasons, for business reasons and data sovereignty reasons. But we sat down with our team and said, well, is this technology, even though we're probably not going to use it at the minute, is it irrelevant to us at the moment? And the answer we came to was, well, no, it's not irrelevant, because there's things coming into Azure that are heading there before they get into the box product, into the on-prem version. Things like row-level security, things like dynamic data masking. So our team kind of thought, well, we can have a first look at these things in Azure, and later on, we think these things might be of interest to us, and that we're ahead of the game then to maybe look at them in a on-prem version. And things change, people change jobs. Now we've got Azure Stack came along. Maybe the data sovereignty things don't matter anymore. So looking at that stuff when we thought it was irrelevant paid big dividends moving forward. And that's a similar story with this legislation. Looking at what's happening in other parts of the world, in GDPR, Europe, even in the States, we heard about California, what's happening there, gives us a good head start to know what might come to us in the future. And there are laws in Australia and New Zealand changing as well. And the law should be, I feel, the moral minimum. We shouldn't be saying, oh, we've just done enough to meet the law, meet the standards. We should be saying, yeah, we've implemented certain sets of encryption, whatever we need to do, and we are above the law, well, not above the law. We implement things that are stronger than the law, and we are looking after your data. We don't see the law as being a bar we have to just meet. We want to go over and above that and give our clients and customers confidence that we're looking after their data and their privacy in the best way we can. So, just a quick example of what happens when you get a bad culture. This lady here, Nadine Norris. So she's a British Member of Parliament, as I'm sure people in the UK know. She sent out this tweet that all the staff have got her login details. A frequent shout out is to say, "What's my password?" Now, this was in response to one of her colleagues who got caught with material on his computer that he shouldn't have. So when asked by the press, he said, "Well, I didn't put it there. Someone else put it there." And the press obviously said, "Well, yeah, that's really interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about this?" At which point he admitted that most of his staff share his login details. So obviously the press had a bit of a field day with him there. And then this tweet come out here. Now, this really says two things about the culture here. Obviously, maybe these don't get on with their IT department that well. There are obviously ways around sharing email that don't involve sharing password. So maybe a quick conversation with IT could have solved this problem. But above that, this lady's obviously in a position to influence people, maybe someone that people look up to, and sending out tweets about sharing passwords just proliferates bad practice through the nation, really. Yeah, it's a very, very sad state of affairs. And I'm sure if anyone listening to this was sharing their passwords in work, they'd have some quite strong disciplinary action taken against them. So that's just an example of culture beating process. One of the main things that I find that we should deal with, and we know we should deal with well, are passwords. And do we even need passwords? We've got things like Windows authentication, Azure security. We've got standard protocols in place to pass identity around systems. And I think these are generally a good thing to use if we can avoid using passwords. But what's the safest password? And that's a password that you don't know. So how can you achieve a password that you don't know? Well, there's a whole range of applications called password safes or password vaults. And we've got so many passwords to deal with nowadays that remembering them all is literally impossible. And I see people keeping these in Excel spreadsheets or writing them down in Notepad or just put them in files on a machine, and they can be easily lost. As we've seen before, people lose computers. They leave files open on their desk, they do whatever. So while some password managers or password managers in general have got some risks associated with them, I think it's a good idea to have a look at these and see, are those risks bigger or less than the risks you're taking at the minute? Are they worth looking at? Because there's a whole range of them about. I personally used to use one called KeePass, and some organizations I've dealt with lately, LastPass, 1Password, and you can literally get these tools to come up with a password, probably a password that you've never come up with yourself, one that involves characters and numbers and letters, and is maybe 20 or 30 characters long. You can copy it into the clipboard, paste it, it'll stay in the clipboard for a few seconds, enough time to copy and paste it. And you might feel that that makes you more secure. Like I said, it's up to you to manage the risk. Maybe you think that it's too risky, but things like these password managers are really good to look at and hopefully can improve your processes. One of the, well, it's not a password manager, but it's a way of getting passwords, is Azure Key Vault. Now, Azure Key Vault is basically a cloud-based system for storing your passwords. So effectively, to get into the vault, you need an identity. So your identity would be managed by Azure Active Directory, which is not just a domain controller in the cloud. Azure AD is a multi-tenant cloud-based directory and identity management service. So you're logged on, or your application is working under an identity. It needs to access a password, say to access a SAP application or a CRM application. It needs a password. So it goes to the password. It says, I want the password for SAP application, gets the password. It can then access the application. And this is possibly a really good way of managing the passwords. You don't need to remember them. You don't need to hard code them into applications. You don't need to encrypt them. All that is taken care of for you behind the scenes. You just need that one identity to make a connection to the Azure Key Vault, and then you can pull out whatever you need to pull out. So we all deal with data, and what tools can we generally get to protect our production data? One of the big things that's quite easy to implement is a technology called transparent data encryption. Now, while our databases have files, live on the file system, and while that data is at rest, it is automatically encrypted. So, and SQL Server looks after this mostly for us behind the scenes. We don't have to do a great deal. We can run a few commands that will encrypt TempDB. There is a slight overhead, like everything in computing. If you've got an extra layer of security or abstraction or whatever, generally speaking, you've got an extra layer of things to do. But we got column level encryption as well. So, for example, you might store a password in the database. Now, I've just talked about Key Vault. Hopefully, that's the place you'll be storing your passwords. But if you wanted to store a credit card number, a telephone number, someone's name, something that you need to encrypt, you've got the ability to encrypt at the column level, and that's quite powerful. Like I talked about, just using standard authentication methods to access databases and other systems saves us from passing passwords around a system. An application recognizes you. It says, oh, I recognize that application. I can communicate with them, give them information they need, whatever. And that could be an application or a human being. And in SQL Server as well, or just generally in computing, we've got certificates that can help manage identity and logging on for us. And one of the things I advise my DBAs and developers to do is to just get familiar with certificates, because certificates are used in an array of different places. For example, maybe you're using one in Service Broker, maybe using one in replication. And then if you have a problem with any of those technologies, and then you've got an additional problem with your certificates on top of that, it's really hard as a DBA to be looking at multiple technologies and thinking, oh, is it the certificate that there's something wrong with? Or is it replication? Or is it my network? Or is it security? So if you've got a good understanding of how to manage certificates and use them and rotate them, that's a really good thing to do as a DBA or even as a developer. But that production data that we just talked about, at some stage, it may be needed in production. Or maybe not the production data itself, maybe something that looks like the production data. And we've got different ways of approaching this. Now, in maybe some places in in the olden days, it was just put it in development. Take your production data, put it in development. We trust our staff. We trust them not to make mistakes. Just put it there. No one will know. No one cares. That's not really the mindset we need to adopt anymore. We need to do something better than that. So what methods are open to us? Well, we can generate the data ourselves. Now that's kind of tricky if you've got an existing database, especially a large database. But if you're designing and implementing a new application or a new database, maybe the overhead isn't so great and you can just simply generate that data yourself. If you then get a problem in production with a piece of data that's caused you a problem, maybe you can replicate that piece of data in your development system and investigate. Or maybe you can just change names and addresses and obfuscate the data. I see various methods of doing this. Some people build their own, which I think is fraught with danger for two main reasons. One, I see people doing things like they'll change an A to a C and a C to an F and things like that. And once people get to know that sort of pattern, which they will at some point, because there's names in databases that, you know, like two letter names or 3-letter names, and you just kind of guess them and say, oh, this is that and that's this, and before you know it, over time the system that people have implemented is just broken. It also doesn't give you a good look on the data. For example, if it was production data and you had a genuine name and now it's changed to 4 or 5 letters that literally don't mean anything, they don't spell anything, they're just data in the database. Or we can build our own. We can maybe maintain a list of names and update our production list of names with the names that we're storing. The benefit there is that it's probably maybe not reversible if you're doing it properly. Again, the overhead there is maintaining it yourself. So one of the solutions I've seen to this problem, I've seen a few solutions, but one of them is an application from Redgate called Data Masker. I've looked at this application with a few people over the course of time, and it's proved good in a few different situations. So in the benefits of time, I'm not going to go into this application in depth, but I'm going to point out some of its really strong points. So when you start the application, you basically go through a wizard of pointing out your database, telling it what you want to do, where the database is, all that sort of thing. And then you're left with the screen that we've got showing at the minute. You've got a controller at the top, and then you've got two what we call trigger managers. So the first one would disable any triggers you've got on your tables, and the last one would re-enable those triggers if needed. Now, you might not have triggers on your database, so this might be irrelevant, but if you're changing data in a large table, you might not want your triggers to fire. You might want to save time doing that. So this is the screen you'll see after you've pointed the application at your database and so forth. So let's now look at what you would go about doing to change a database. So I've got a database over here. It's got a simple table in it. It's a customers table. It's got 100 records in it. And what we're going to do, we're going to look at this before I've run the data masking tool, which we're looking at the moment, and then we're going to run it. We're going to look at it again after I've run the data masking tool. So we'll see the before method. Now, I'm going to change these names based on their gender. So I want male names to end up as male names and I want female names to end up as female names. But you might notice that in this database, I've got some null values in there and maybe even a gender separate from male or female. So if I was just to change male names to male names and female names to female names, I'd obviously miss those three records in there. So let's look at a process to use the tool and maybe not miss those. So I've got 3 tasks here. They're called substitution rules, 2 substitution rules, and another one called a row internal rule. We'll look at them in a bit more depth and find out what they're doing. So the first rule, we're going to change our given names. In our customer table, we've got a given name, a family name, and we've got a phone number. Now we want to change those, but we still want the outcome to look similar to the production database. So we'll say over here, we want to change our names to, I've got female names here. See if I can open that up a bit more. I can't open it up anymore, but all the names, that's every single name in the database, is being changed to a female name. The family name is getting changed to a random family name generated from a list of surnames. And our phone number will be changed to a pattern, rather like a regular expression I've got in here, which matches a phone number from Australia, 2 digits followed by 4 digits, followed by 4 digits. Now, there are prearranged patterns that you can choose from, but just for demonstration purposes, I've decided to show how something similar to a regular expression would work. So that's how the first substitution rule would work. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but you've just changed every single name in that database to a female name. Now, why have you done that? Well, that ensures that every name is changed, regardless of whether it's male or female, the gender's missing, or the gender's something different. Every name is changed to a female name. So in the second step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change every male name to a male name. And doing those 2 things will ensure that the correct look and feel of the database is maintained. So after these 2 steps, what we've actually done, we've got the names, the first names, and the given names both change to different names. And that process is not reversible. So that means that no one can guess that Stuart in the dev database equals the name Martin in the production database. So then we've got one more rule to look at, and this one's called a row internal rule. So now we've changed the first name and the last name, we're left with an email address in there. Now the email address is still a valid email address, but we want to change it to something that looks like it matches the name. So we've used something that you might use in a where clause to create a fake email address. But the fake email address still looks and feels like a proper email address. So let's go back over to Management Studio now and see what this looks like. Oh, before we do that, I suppose I better actually run the masking set. So I will just move. So I'll just run the masking set. I'm asked if I want to run the roles. I do want to run the roles, and we'll see that it's running through. It's completed successfully. And then we'll shift back to Management Studio and we look at the new data. So we've ordered this exactly the same, and we can see that in the first place, we got a record number 1, this name, and what do we have over here? We've got a different name, but that different name now looks like it might have a correct email address. So all the data in there is actually fake, along with the phone number that we generated through our expression. And that looks and feels like production data. So for me, this is a really good tool to use to place production-like data in development. Now, I've just been through that manually to show how it works, but this can be done as part of a automated process. So you can script this with PowerShell, and you could have like a process maybe running every day or every so often to back your production database up, run this process across it, and then make that backup available to your development team to put on the development server or wherever it needs to go. So that's one method of handling production data in a non-production environment. So let's start wrapping up now by looking at access and privilege. And this is where I think we might need a different kind of mindset to what we've used in the past as developers or DBAs. We really need to be thinking, what's the minimum amount of access I actually need to do my job? Very often you'll go into places as a consultant, you'll ask for access to look at a table, to do something fairly trivial, and you'll end up with SA access because people either don't know how to give you the set of permissions you need, or they just want to do it really quickly and get on with doing something else. But at this point, we need our leadership skills to shine through and hold that person or that process to account and say, hang on, I don't actually need the access that you're giving me. And that really serves two purposes. You're not getting higher level access, so you're at less risk of making a mistake and causing a problem. But also, if there is a problem later on, and if their data does get leaked, then you didn't have the access that could have potentially put you in the picture as a cause of that leak. So exercising, like, I don't know, the law of least privilege is a really good thing to do. And it's something that I've not really done in the past, but it's something that I'm starting to do now, is to call out people who want to give me more access than I actually need. So the company in general probably needs, or the team needs to have a good process for doing this, to find out what the individual or the team needs and be able to give them those exact permissions, or maybe something similar but not too much above what they actually want. And this sort of comes back to the theme of compliant DevOps, to have systems running that check these sorts of things to make sure that Morton's access is the same today as it is tomorrow, and run processes from time to time, and if things have changed, to flag that and make sure that we stay compliant all the time. So to quickly summarize, we talked a bit about GDPR and similar legislation around the world. We talked about laws that are coming out in the States, in places like Canada. The GDPR will obviously may change and morph over time. New Zealand, Australia, they've got more stringent laws or regulations coming out in future. So even though you might be in a part of the world where these things seemingly don't apply to you, it's probably a really good career move to keep your eye on what jurisdictions are doing and what laws they're bringing out, what regulations they're setting, what kind of encryption they advise maybe to use, what do they say is not good enough, what is intended, but what can you do above that? How can you tell your customers and your clients that, yeah, we don't just meet these standards, we go above these standards. because as computers get faster, some of these things will start, I don't know, getting cracked at some point, and then we'll have to move on. So privacy and security, they do have a cost, and I think that's a big cost. I was at a client site last week, and it took them over a day to get me the permissions I needed to work on their environment. And that's like a day's worth of potentially sitting around, testing permissions, making sure they are right. Whereas they would have had a good process to put that into place in the initially, then maybe they could have done it in half an hour or an hour. Instead, I wasted a whole day of my time and their money getting these permissions right. And things like that are driving up costs for everyone in general. They eventually get passed on to the customers of that client, whether they make breakfast cereal or washing up powder or whatever. And that's just raising the prices of everything for everyone around the world. So I think generally, as an industry, we probably need to get better processes at looking after this privacy and security. I personally feel that using standard tools is a good thing, but a lot of people say, oh, why do I need to use a standard method of authentication for my security privacy? I see a lot of people that think if I use a standard algorithm or a standard method, then other people know what it is and they can very easily circumvent it. But that's not the case really. For example, Windows authentication. It's got many people at Microsoft have worked on this tirelessly over the years to make it stock standard secure. If there's a hole in it and it comes to light, it's literally fixed by a lot of people who are very knowledgeable. So building your own security system is probably not going to be up to the same standard as systems like that. Systems like Azure Active Directory, where identity is fundamental and systems recognize you and make it a whole bunch more secure than possibly you could make it. Creating standards. Standards are good. Standards mean that we can do similar things all the time and they are repeatable. We can build tools that implement standards and do it cleanly and crisply every single time. But having a rigid process is maybe as bad as having no process. If we've seen an example before of how culture sort of trumps process because maybe people seeing the process as too rigid or not changeable, and that is a problem in itself. So building good processes, building trust, working in good teams is definitely something that we should be thinking about and doing. Making sure we've got the correct access and for the correct amount of time. Very often I'll go to places and they'll be like, oh, you're going to be in here for 2 days. They'll give me access and then I'll do my 2 days. I'll go back to the same client a year later and my access is still there. It's never been taken away. However, there's other places where you can go and they'll be like, oh, you're going to be there 2 days. So we'll give you a login mapped to a certificate. That login's got all the access you need, but it will definitely be taken away after 2 days because the certificate will expire and you'll no longer have access. And that's a good process to have. It means that there's no people hanging around in your system that actually don't need access to the system. Attitudes to auditing. I think traditionally we've seen auditing as something that's intended to catch us out. And if we fall foul of that process, we'll be beaten up or or action will be taken against us to discipline us. I think how we should be looking at processes like auditing and monitoring and logging is to identify flaws in our systems so we can address them straight away, and to educate our teams on better ways of doing things. So if our auditing process brings something to light that we don't like, well, obviously that's not a great thing to happen. But if we can address that straight away through a process of education and timely action, then that's a really good thing to have happen, and it'll result in a far more secure system, which obviously more private for our clients and our customers. And using production data in non-production environments. So we've seen a tool there from Redgate that helps manage the process really well. Obviously, you could do something similar yourself, but you've got the overhead then of looking after it and maintaining it. And there's a lot more that that tool can do that I've had time to show in this particular presentation. So that's a summary of data privacy for the data professional. Be safe out there, and if there's any questions, please feel free to ask Richard. He'll send them through to me in a minute. I put in some resources here, some people that you might find interesting. There's a guy down here in Australia called Troy Hunt. He's a security person. He's got lots of good posts on security, privacy, using certificates, a whole range of things. It runs a website called Have I Been Pwned that keeps track of data breaches that happen around the world. There's some links to the lady I spoke about before, Tanya Janka. She's got some really good stuff on developer security. And I'll leave you with a lot to pick through there. So thanks for listening to me. And Richard, are there any questions?
Yeah, we don't appear to have any questions coming in from the audience at the moment. I can only assume that they're thinking very long and hard about the questions they want to ask.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
If I could draw everybody's attention to that handouts section on the control panel, the slides for this presentation are actually in there as well as a PDF. So if you want the slides now, you can go and get those. Now would be a good time to think about joining your local PASS chapter. If you're already a member of PASS, that's great. If you're not, consider it. Go look at pass.org. Go to Summit in the autumn of this year. It's every year. It's a great event. See how the community works for you and how many people you can get to meet and how many people you can help.
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
Richard, now's probably a good time to be thinking about flights over to the US.
Yeah.
I know I'll be thinking about booking my flight probably in the next month or so, and maybe you can jump on some pretty good deals.
Yeah, there's PASS. If you go to pass.org and the events page, they actually have a template business case that you can download and fill in. So you can fill it in and send it in to your manager, and it's almost guaranteed acceptance that your manager might actually pay for it, which I think is quite nice. I certainly used it last year. Okay, I don't think we're going to have any questions at the moment. Can we take the next slide, please, Martin?
Yeah, we sure can.
Yeah. Cool. So don't forget, coming up next, stay tuned for our next session, a techie's view on meeting compliance with Brian Kelly. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for Martin to presenting, and we'll hopefully see you on the next set of webinars from PASS. Thanks.
Yeah, and can I just say thanks for your time, Richard, and thanks to the audience. It's nearly 2 o'clock in the morning over here in Australia, and I will be off to bed very shortly. So good night and thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Good night.